And welcome everyone into our space today with did that hit record start?
Yes.
Okay. With Bernal Cruz for our part two session focused on holistic support for unaccompanied minors. Very thrilled to have his support and expertise with us at HIAS as we embark on providing more best practices and guidance around accompanying these children and the families and constellation of other folks in their lives with the best quality kind of care we could imagine. Um, Bernal is a very dynamic speaker and had a chance with HIAS and Endeavors and everyone else on the call today to share with us a part one to this, which was on September 27th. And we do have that recording, which we're happy to disseminate after this session alongside a guidance tool that we're in the process of developing that really kind of marries these two sessions in terms of some best practice tips that you can bear in mind when supporting unaccompanied minors. So it's my pleasure to build upon session one and pass to Bernal. I know you have a slide that maybe shares your background and bio. Just to say before that, that I've had the pleasure of working alongside Bernal in my local community for 8 years or so, maybe
Yeah.
more. I can't remember. Um,
2013, I think it was when we met.
all right then, we're over a decade
9
now.
years. Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
Um,
11.
and very happy that he's able to support us with this training series and with the guidance tool that we'll be developing. So to you, Bernal, just cue me when you want me to advance the slides.
Thank you. We're going to move through the first few slides rather quickly. We have actually a lot of material. I know I said that last time, but this could have easily been 3, 4, or 5 sessions, but I'm going to try not to bore you to death. I'm also going to try not to inundate you and overwhelm you with information. I definitely want to start by thanking HIAS. Sasha, Megan have been instrumental in putting this together. I really appreciate your feedback and your thoughts on the flow and the information that we need to present. So thank you very much. I also want to thank Stephanie Remla, who's here from Endeavors. I had to consult with her yesterday to make sure that the things I'm presenting are in sync with the current practices with PRS, and that'll become more relevant and obvious later. So thank you so very much for your input. I've learned a lot in trying to put this together, and most of it is really good, but a lot of it actually just opens up more questions, and I don't think that comes as a surprise to most of us, right? The more you get into, how systems are working, sometimes the more questions you have, and I hope that doesn't scare you. I hope you perceive it or are able to frame it as an opportunity to really affect some change and to advocate for the communities that we work with and for. This slide right here just talks about, essentially what are we trying to build upon here, right? I'm not going to read all of this. We presented this last week. There might be some new information here. I think the last bottom slides are the new information. We're going to learn about how to impart these best practices, which will be strength-based, trauma-informed. And we'll also, if we get to it, talk a little bit about some considerations for staff. The work can be exhausting, and we can oftentimes feel depleted. So it's always important to address that. I know the agencies that are on here are also very sort of proactive in that regard, and hopefully in your places of work you have enough support, and these topics are not new to you, such as vicarious trauma and burnout. I think we can go on to the next slide, which I think is just my bio. We just put it on here for those of you who were not here last time. And so, because this is being recorded, I will also move right through this. You can read that at your leisure. It's my pleasure to be here, and also a real pleasure to have worked with Sasha for as long as we have, actually. I think maybe the highlight of this is that, part of the thing that really draws me to the work that I do is that I identify with the community that we work with, right? And as much as I did not travel to the US as an unaccompanied child, I did come to the US as a child many, 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 many years ago. And the geopolitical climate and the attitude towards migrants was much more different then. But something to highlight is that my personal wait for resolution for my status adjustment in the US took 15 years. So some of those things have not changed a whole lot. I arrived as a 13-year-old and I was able to visit my grandma for the first time as a 28-year-old. So quite different type of relationship at that point. Next, we'll look at our agenda for today. On the left side, you'll see the topics we covered last time. And on the right side, we have the topics that hopefully we'll be able to address today, including challenges that kids encounter after they're released. We'll talk about special concerns and populations, vulnerable populations. We'll talk about current narratives around unaccompanied children, sort of where those come from, how they get how they evolve, to what extent do we have anything to do with that? Can we interrupt? Can we disrupt? Can we begin to change those narratives? Do we want to? And why should we, right? We'll talk about considerations for staff, and we will be referencing the guidance document, although it's not ready, and that will be made available to all of you through HIAS eventually. Right. So if we are to recap our session, our previous session, we talked about how children ultimately enter the care facilities. When we talk about the care facilities, we're talking about the shelter facilities where they are housed. During that experience, they will be working with a case manager who is in charge of submitting a release request to the government to ensure that they can review all the proper documentation and they can, in this manner, vet the sponsor and make a decision about the reunification. If everything goes well, the child is reunified. I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but in 2021, Endeavors reunified something like 36,000 families. So it's not nothing, and I definitely feel like based on that experience, I have some expertise and some authority to speak on these topics. But, that is a pretty phenomenal number during which we learned a lot. It's also worth mentioning that during that time, the rules, the policies sort of keep shifting, right? So the way we worked on week one was not the way we were working by the end of the week. The basic principles were the same, but a lot of rules had changed. It's a very dynamic space where we have to constantly keep up with the demands of the government and the requisites that they have. We touched upon the Flores Agreement, sometimes called the Flores Act. It basically states that, when children are either apprehended or turn themselves in, these agencies of control, such as Border Patrol or ICE, must release the children to the Office of Refugee Resettlement within 72 hours. In the event that doesn't happen, there's an internal document that is then turned over to the government, and it's basically us saying, hey, these guys at the border aren't doing what they said they would do. And that is all in the interest of the safety and the wellness of the children, right? Like I said, the process of releasing the minor is intense, and it's very detailed, and the standards all need to be met before we can submit a release request on behalf of the minor. Sometimes those standards are not met. Sometimes we may think the standards are being met, and we send a release request only to be told, you haven't done this or this or this, right? Sometimes we push back. That's not required for the sponsor category. Or there actually are no identified concerns, which is why we're submitting this. A really good example would be a case in which somebody in the government says, why did you not request a home study for this case based on X, Y, or Z? And if we did not request a home study, we then have to provide an answer as to why, because it doesn't represent a risk to the minor, right? Something along those lines. Now, we can all agree to disagree. Ultimately, what the government is asking us to do is to submit a recommendation. They're welcome to disagree. When they do disagree, usually they have to justify why they're disagreeing. So I worked with federal field specialists who welcome these disagreements. And I worked with some federal field specialists who really would like you to just see eye to eye with them, and may sometimes use tactics to pressure you into changing your recommendation. I try to empower the case manager, and I try to convey to them that, if you're able to defend your position, then you should stick to your guns, right? And I think that is probably the most important aspect of case management, is that you have to know what you're talking about. You have to understand policy, and you have to have conviction about what you're saying. Without those things, you may not really be able to properly advocate for the child and make your case. The opposite would be somebody who doesn't really understand the rules, somebody who hasn't really made up their mind about the recommendation and is going to then just bend backwards whenever the FFS, the federal field specialist, says this doesn't meet my standard, this doesn't meet the standard, and then we just say, okay, I'm sorry, I'll change it, right? That's not what we want. We want you to be really conscious and aware of the recommendations you're making. The fact is, oral ultimately makes the decision about release, right? And after release, the children may be referred to post-release services. We'll continue to refer to that as PRS, post-release services, or this sort of newer concept to me of preferred communities for either gap services or intensive case management. So that's a recap from last week. The next slide, you see a brief overview, and this is not exhaustive, of course, right? But this is generally what happens when children are admitted into our care facility. I know looking at this can be a little overwhelming, especially if you weren't here last time, but let me walk you through this very easily, okay, very quickly. If a child is admitted to an OR care facility, a shelter facility, ours is in Pecos, Texas, for the record. So the child is apprehended at the border, transported to Pecos, Texas, welcome into our facility. That for that child to be at that facility, we have to determine that that child is a child under 18, and 2, unaccompanied. That's without their parent or guardian. Once they enter the facility, they'll be admitted. So there's a series of assessments and questionnaires that the child undergoes. This is within the first day or two. We determine if the child has a sponsor or does not have a sponsor. If the child does not have a sponsor, that is just by definition considered a category 4. Children who are category 4s then will be referred to long-term care facilities or long-term group homes. They will also be referred to a legal service provider to identify whether they have an option to adjust their status in the US. The natural question is, what if they don't? If they don't, repatriation becomes a very real thing for them, and that definitely does happen. If the child does have a sponsor, then we have to determine which category of sponsor. We'll get into that as well. But ultimately, we have to determine, in order to get to release this child, will we be conducting a home study or not? There's rules for these, right? And so it's, for the most part, black and white. If the child meets a standard for a home study, then the child is referred to have a home study, in which case the home study can be either positive or negative. If the home study comes out as positive, then we can submit for the safe release of this minor. If the child is negative, then we need to find a new sponsor. I don't mean to be cavalier or funny, but families will tell you, like if this sponsor doesn't work out, we are in a lot of trouble because we have nobody else. We don't know anyone else. We have no friends. We have no family. We don't know anybody else. More often than not, the parent and country of origin finds out that reunification is not possible because this home study was negative, and almost out of woodwork, you have other friends and other family who can actually step up and be sponsors. So, once we've identified a sponsor and the home study comes out, there are things we can do to sort of mitigate the concerns identified in the home study. But if that really cannot be done, more often than not, that child will be sponsored by somebody else who the family will eventually identify. Incidentally, for any child who is transferred to a Category 4 facility, the first task of the staff in the Category 4 facility is to reinvestigate and re-explore the possibilities of reunification with the folks that the previous facility said were not eligible sponsors. The process of trying to assess whether or not there is a sponsor for this child doesn't really end because they've been deemed Category 4. That exploration will continue. Sometimes it's exhausting, especially for the case manager. The case manager understands, no, there really is nobody else. But the pressure exists to please give them a call again, see if anything's changed. Do they live in a different place? Is their home environment any better? Do they now have the capacity to do that because they have a job, right? So that exploration kind of never ends because we don't ever want to abandon the possibility of this child being with whom they should be with, right? Okay, so that was really brief, and it really is not fair to the actual process that happens, but that is essentially the story of what happens when children are admitted into care facilities. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Megan to talk about the next few slides about what happens when children are released from ORR and then enter either are referred through URM or a UC referral after release.
Thank you, Bernal. For those of you who were here last time, this might be a bit of a review for some of the things that we went over in the first session. Also, I'm Megan, so I am a program specialist, but I also handle the URM and UC referrals that come from ORR that we send out to our affiliate network. So again, we showed this chart last time, just highlighting some differences between what a URM referral is and what a UC referral is. URM referrals are unaccompanied refugee minors who are turning 18 and they're aging out of the URM program. So these minors do not have sponsors. On the other hand, UC referrals or unaccompanied children referrals, these are released from ORR supervision to a sponsor. And one of the key differences between these, URM referrals are usually more individualized. We get different deadlines for them. We get slightly different expectations from ORR depending on the minor situation. While UC referrals, we usually kind of get, the referrals are more uniform with the same amount of information, the same type of information. And for each one, we get a deadline of 2 weeks to get an update from the affiliate. Next slide, please. All right, and we also showed this last time. This is a flow chart that shows like once a child is released from an ORR shelter, you see referrals, kind of what happens. So HIAS gets the referral from ORR. HIAS takes that referral and then sends it on to the assigned affiliate, signed by ORR. The affiliate will then attempt contact with whoever contact information has been provided by ORR. It's usually the sponsor, I believe. Sometimes if it's the minor is, a teenager and they have contact info, it'll be the minor themselves. And then from there, the affiliate will attempt to kind of give an orientation to PC and schedule an intake if necessary. Sometimes the affiliate is unable to get in touch with the minor or the sponsor. Any contact attempts that are made, they need to be documented and then sent back to HIAS, sends them back to ORR. But if an orientation for PC services is done, an intake is done, or the minor is interested in PC services, they can be enrolled, and then HIAS receives that update, also passes it on to ORR. Sometimes after the orientation and intake, the client is not interested in PC services. That is also an update that would go back to HIAS and back to ORR. Next slide, please. This is a chart, again, this is a chart from ORR, kind of describing the one I had first, differences between URM and UC referrals. So in the first column, that is for UC referrals, second column is URM referrals. So again, you can see some of the same information. The turnaround time for UC referrals is usually 2 weeks. For URM referrals, it varies. Client profile, so UC referrals, these are Cuban and Haitian minors who are under 18. URM referrals, these are often victims of trafficking who are, again, turning 18. They're going to be aging out of the URM program. Next slide, please. And then here's just some information. If you're an affiliate who has received a referral from me, this will look familiar. This is specific to UCs. But the information that we'll usually get in a password protected spreadsheet from ORR includes this. So you'll get the client name, the A number, date of birth, date of discharge from ORR, sponsor category, sponsor's name, relationship, the address where the client is currently living, languages spoken, and then you'll also get a document that's usually the verification of release from ORR and also a notice to appear. And then again, this is specific to UCs. It'll be a little different for URM since they do not have a sponsor. So that sponsor information will not be there. Usually instead will be the information for their current case manager in the URM program. And I will pass it back to Bernal.
Thank you very much.
I'm gonna flag for you so we can address it now, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yvonne has a very important question. She was raising it last time, and I think it would be great to respond and know that this is definitely a theme of some critique we wanted to offer in today's session. Is Yvonne, I don't know if you want to come off mute and ask yourself, and if so, please do. Otherwise, I can read what you've put in the chat. Do you have a preference?
Yeah, I can share. Sorry, guys, I'm a little bit like trying to do several things at the same time. We had a referral from a youth that was aging out, and she was in a group shelter, and we received that referral through HIAS. So we contact the organization that is in charge in this area in Pittsburgh to provide services to youth that are unaccompanied in their organization. But it was very confusing to all of us involved, because what the shelter did was to connect the youth, because they tried their best to find a sponsor or someone to provide, like this kid didn't have a relative or anyone to be reunited with. So the shelter contacts CYF, that the Children and Youth Organization, through the to the Human Services Department here in Pittsburgh. And the CYF took responsibility to provide services to this youth and place here in a youth group center, enroll them to school, provide hygiene items, provide all of the support that this minor need. I still met with the shelter, the CYF team, and this kid didn't need anything from PC, because luckily, everything was provided by CYF, because they are mandated to do that. So I was still very confused, and the shelter was also confused as to why ORR make that referral to us, and then we ended up deciding like the minor didn't need PC services. So I just wanted to clarify if that was like a one-time thing that was a mistake, or if that's the standard process
Right.
that will happen all the time.
Gracias, Yvonne. Thank you so much
De
for
nada.
a very good question. So I will always speak as if ORR is in the room. Okay. So I'm gonna start with that. The reality is that at some point, ORR sort of received more pressure to ensure that after release, these children were being accounted for and were receiving the services that they needed. How those services would be delivered does not seem to be something that was developed in a very intentional or deliberate manner. So I think probably what has happened, and this is just my guess, okay, what's happened is that rather than find out that somebody's not receiving services, we're going to make sure they're getting services, even if it's from different angles. That's what it seems like to me. I have some visuals later that you're going to be able to go like, oh, okay, I see. And this is not unique. It seems as if there is the potential for duplication of services kind of across the board. And I think the only thing that we can sort of like do about that really is to ensure that the child who's receiving the services understands that if this person is helping you with this and I'm also here to do this, then this is something that you don't have to opt in for, right? Megan was just sharing with us that, ultimately the child and the family is able to say, yeah, these are services that we'll find super useful, or, at this point, I kind of don't need those services, right? Now, another way to look at this is to just reframe it for ourselves. And as much as we call it in our industry duplication of services, by the way, in the capitalist world is called competition, right? But we refer as duplication of services, the opportunity to collaborate also manifests itself, right? So is there something that an agency is not doing that we could be doing? That's another way to sort of frame this. But Yvonne, you point out something that we're definitely going to get into today. I think you're kind of, this is a little bit foreshadowing for what we're going to be talking about in about, 15 slides. Samara is here.
Yes, Yvonne, back then, there was so much emphasis on duplication of services, but now there is more emphasis on collaboration, making sure that client is getting services. So even there are two, three providers. It's okay to be enrolled in multiple ORR funded programs and services. However, there should be coordination. For example, if this agency does not have any funds for housing assistance, but our affiliate has it, then it's best to keep that in mind and provide that family with gap services. So even at that moment, maybe family or child doesn't need these services. If they are informed that they can come back to your agency anytime and seek for help, that's also useful information to share and leave the contacts.
Thank you. I think I would like to own something here. I think it's a little bit of a calamity to put the child in the position of saying, like, I don't need those services because this other person is doing it, right? Like the people who are collaborating really need to design a service plan that makes sense. And so how we would do that is presumably being in contact with whatever other case manager is trying to also provide services, right? Again, an opportunity for collaboration perhaps, but also, a little bit of a mess because it ends up putting the child in the middle sometimes. So it's not ideal. And those of you who have worked at PCC, which is the large facility I was at, is like, we're really familiar with this notion of, we often talk about building the airplane as we're trying to fly it. It may not seem very safe, right? But sometimes it's like we don't really have a choice. And eventually you just kind of become really adept, right? Thank you for that. And please don't hold back. If you have questions, put them in there. I know Sasha's paying attention and she'll make sure that we get to them in the right moment. And it's an important clarifying issue. I'm going to just slow down a little bit because I know I was speaking very fast, and we're now at a point where, we're sort of introducing new material. In my mind, this is sort of where presentation 2 kind of starts. I have a case study here for you all. I would like to read it. Typically, I'd ask for somebody to read it, but in the interest of time, since I'm familiar with it, since I wrote it, I'd like to read it. And so you can just take relax for a moment. I'm going to describe this case. It is a little complicated. It's all on purpose. And then we'll have some follow-up questions for you, okay? So this is a child who has entered an OR care facility such as the PCC shelter where I work, or the Morrison facilities here in Portland, right? Or any of other reunification facilities. So this is Carelis. She's a 16-year-old self-identified girl from Venezuela. She's come to the U.S. to reunify with her deceased brother's fiance, right? So the brother passed away. Mayra is this potential sponsor. She's 25 years old, and Carelis used to live with her back in Venezuela. Mayra and Carelis they lived together with the brother until he passed away due to a motor accident, a vehicular accident. And that was about 2 years ago. And at that time, Mayra came to live to the U.S., and she promised Carelis that she would sponsor her. Carelis has always referred to Mayra as her sister-in-law. Mayra is motivated to sponsor Carelis because she is aware that Carelis counts with little or no support from her family back home after she accused her maternal uncle of sexually abusing her when she was 11 years old, so about 5 years ago. Carelis never knew her dad, but her mother sent her to go live with her brother when the allegations of abuse surfaced about 5 years ago. So the mom felt the child was unfairly accusing her own brother of sexual abuse, and she said, go live with your brother and Mayra. So now she's here in the US and she wants to be sponsored by Mayra. So with that in mind, we have some questions to elicit, hopefully, a lively conversation here. Please describe what the case manager priorities should be and how you would formulate this case for release. What concerns need to be mitigated and how will they be addressed? What other information are you going to need to ensure the safe and timely release of this minor? Note, please, that I'm not saying to Mayra, and that's not a hint necessarily. I'm saying this child will eventually be released. We think Mayra is a potential sponsor, but what else do we need to know before we even consider the release of this child? You're welcome to use the chat. You're also welcome to raise your hand.
This may feel very applicable for some of our Endeavors colleagues that are on the call in terms of the response that you might take and how you're working to ensure the safety and timely release of the minor. Anyone have any thoughts or comments?
And we can also break this down. Like, the first question is, what are the priorities, right? So what if you're going to reunify a child, what is the first thing you need to do is you need to identify a sponsor. I don't know if the case is overwhelming or everyone's shy. Okay, I will save you. The identified sponsor is Mayra, who Carelis has always referred to as her sister-in-law. The word for that in Spanish is cuñada. I could just hear her saying, mi cuñada, mi cuñada. The fact of the matter is, Mayra was never married to the brother. She is not a sister-in-law, not on paper, not for our purposes. And so this becomes a category 3 unrelated sponsor, if it's even going to work, right? So there's a real challenge. The category 3 unrelated sponsor is the type of category, the type of sponsorship that gives the government most pause and most concern. There will be a lot of questions about this, right? And further, the challenge will be to convince Carelis that based on what we know, she actually is not your sister-in-law, right? And that can be displacing for a child, right? In fact, they might get really upset with you. How dare you tell me she's not my sister-in-law? She's the only person I have in the world and I consider family, and you're telling me she's not my family? So a lot of education will have to take place there, right? It's just a formality. This is the paper trail that we have. It doesn't actually add up. So we're going to move forward with this person who is in fact not related to you, right? So that's the priority number 1, is identify the sponsor correctly. This is a category 3 unrelated. The concerns that need to be mitigated are numerous, right? This child experienced sexual abuse at an early age. And also was essentially kicked out of her house to go live somewhere else, and then lost the only person that apparently seemed to believe her, right? And so just the sexual abuse in itself qualifies this child for a TVPRA home study. And we talked about that last week. One of the criteria is sexual abuse. So if this child experienced sexual abuse in such manner that it affected her life, and it did because she was displaced from her home, she had to go live somewhere else. Now she has to undergo a home study. And the home study cannot happen if Mayra isn't interested in having a home study, right? And you can probably imagine what Mayra's reaction is going to be to this, right? All I've ever tried is to help her. Now you're investigating me. Somebody's going to come to my house and go through my stuff. That's going to be upsetting. And so there's a lot of sort of educating and holding hands that will need to happen there. So one will have to be conducting a TVPRA home study. And that means this child will be referred to post-release services. And we'll talk about that in just a minute as well, right? This child will be referred to post-release services if the reunification in fact happens with Mayra, right? So that's another concern. It's the sexual abuse, the abandonment essentially from the parent will be addressed via a home study. While the child is in care, they'll also be referred to clinical services, right? To ensure that this child is okay and intact. All these conversations about the reasons why she can't just reunify with her sister-in-law are likely to elicit some of those, trauma reactions from her as well. And so we'll be keeping an eye on her very closely in care. And then it says here, what other information will you need to ensure the safe and timely release of this minor? My mind goes initially to the composition of the home. Where does Mayra live, right? How long has she been here? How is she doing? Is she stable? Is she experiencing some displacement of her own, right? And all those questions can be answered by the home study. But it would, the case manager do well to really try to establish some rapport with the potential sponsor. Some things that would give me pause are if Mayra is in a predicament where she's not working yet and she's kind of living in a home with household members who are maybe very excited to get her moving. You just kind of got to get out of here, go get a job and get out. Like you can stay here for a couple of weeks, but you need to go somewhere else. Maybe Mayra lives with a bunch of men because that's the only place that she could find, right? Maybe Mayra has a brother or relative who is a male and there's only one bedroom in the household. So the composition of the household will be really important to also. So those are some of the concerns that we really need to be thinking about. I wonder if anybody else has anything that comes to mind based on the information that you see here. Well, one other thing that I would really encourage you to think about is the fact that the reunification really involves the parent and country of origin. And so that is going to be also a series of difficult conversations that the case manager is probably going to have with the parent and country of origin. If the parent and country of origin was fine with her going to live with her brother in Maida in the first place, it's very likely that she's fine with her staying in the US. But if the parent and country of origin says, yeah, I'm not really interested in having my child in another country or living with somebody who, you know, has supported her in her fabrications in the past, you have a real problem, right? Now that may be addressed more easily because now we have reason to believe that this parent was not acting in the best interest of the child. But the reality is that that parent still has rights. We may not like it, but that parent still has rights. So, you know, it'll be interesting to determine what the parent's attitude towards reunifying with Maida would be. These are all things that really we need to be concerned. Of course, it doesn't end when the child is released. If the home study happens and it's positive and Maida lives in an environment that's positive and conducive to the wellness of the child, and we get a thumbs up to release this child to Maida, that's the beginning of another set of services and another set of challenges that will happen, right? And those will likely be post-release services, most definitely. And more than likely, in fact, we'll look at the eligibility for PC later on. So this would be, like Yvonne pointed out, one of those cases where there would be PRS and a PC referral, right? We'll talk about that in some depth later on. Are there any questions about that case? Okay. So as we sort of conceptualize the story of Karelis and her trajectory, you know, I've made a reference to this idea and concept of the triple trauma paradigm, which Sasha initially introduced me to when we started working together. But the triple trauma paradigm really just establishes that most of the time children have experienced trauma in their country of origin. Most of these children have experienced childhood adverse events in their lives prior to coming to the U.S. And, you know, the harm that has come to them may not be only to them, but to their families or communities. And upon making the decision to travel to the U.S., we talked about how children are arriving to the U.S. We talked specifically about kids who are coming from Central America and take the train or, you know, sort of use the services of guides, which are really cartels or organized crime to get to the U.S. And those experiences are oftentimes sort of peppered with traumatic experiences or potentially traumatic experiences like kidnappings or witnessing terrible things along the way or falling victim to assault and other things. And lastly is this third leg of a stool, right? That is the adjustment. So arriving into the US, the reunification is really an unusual experience. It's very different. But after reunification, we have the difficult process of adjusting to a new environment. For some folks, this process never really ends. It's constantly shifting and evolving, but one just always continues to feel like perhaps I don't belong here, or I am made to feel as if I don't belong, right? Healthy and proper adjustment is critical, but it's made difficult sometimes by external stressors and variables such as living in an unwelcoming environment or the challenges of living with a difficult sponsor, just to name a couple of examples. So it's really important that we conceptualize these three aspects of how kids will continue to sort of struggle with things, especially in the adjustment phase, which in a very personal way, I think the adjustment is probably the most difficult part. One of the things that makes the adjustment a very difficult part of all this is because most people, especially people who are trying to help you, quote, get there, will think, well, now that it's over, right? Now that you're out of your country, now that you've already gone through the experience of the journey, now that you've been released to your family, everything's going to be okay, right? And in some way, I feel like children experience a little bit of lack of validation of the difficulty that adjusting can be, right? Everything should be okay. You have everything you want, milk and honey and cereal and soda and pizza and after-school activities and a cell phone, right? Why are you so upset? And, you know, it's difficult because that process, again, like I said, it just sometimes it doesn't really end and folks feel really sort of alone and to some extent abandoned in that process, right? Thank you, Sasha. We can move on here. And so to better understand the challenges in adjusting, I think it's really important that we talk about these sort of theoretical concepts of assimilation and acculturation. And I very deliberately say theoretically, because for those of you nerds who would like to get out there on the internet and find out more about these concepts, there are exhaustive videos and academic journals and all kinds of information about these ideas of adjustment, right? So on the one hand, we have this idea of acculturation, right? In acculturation, so what we're talking about is somebody who is from a different place, a different culture, entering a new environment to a host community, into a host community, right? The adaptation process this is an adaptation process that occurs when two or more cultures come into contact. It involves adopting new beliefs, behaviors, and forms of culture of the dominant group, the host community, in the new culture. It does not require rejection of the original cultural values. So here's a process by which children, because we're talking about children, but this is really true for any sort of migrant, right? In fact, one would argue that maybe children have an easier time with this, right? Children do not have to reject their customs, their foods, their language, right? But in assimilation, this process is the complete adoption of the dominant culture as well as the rejection of the previous culture. This is often demanded of immigrants into society, right? I found some really interesting examples. I found an example of assimilation that really actually doesn't refer to migrants at all. Well, it does, but in a very sort of tricky way. It actually used the experience of Native Americans in North America when the area was colonized, right? Native Americans were made to really sort of reject their language, their customs, and really adopt new ones, even though they were in their own land, right? So that's a really interesting example of assimilation. But other more simple examples are, our friends from China. It's very often I meet a person from China named Edward, for example, right? Or Lucas. It's like these are not Chinese names. We all know that. But even when you introduce yourself to somebody from China and you ask them their name, they'll be like, do you want my Chinese name? Because they have come to the point where they really exercise this practice of having two names for the sake of ease, right? And without going too far into it, my own supervisor and boss has shared his experience in shifting his name from Alejandro to Alex back to Alejandro in an attempt to really sort of reclaim identity, right? And that's really what happens. If we move on to the other slide, there's something really important that is established here. These are the similarities between assimilation and acculturation. But one of the differences is, if you look at the third box on the differences, is acculturation is a mutual exchange while assimilation is unidirectionally, right? It just requires the person in the new community to sort of adopt to the new environment and really kind of abandon. And equally, or perhaps even more important, is the second box. And I'm going from the bottom to the top here. Acculturation is more conscious, right? And when I read that, I think deliberate, right? Intentional. While assimilation happens just because that's how you're surviving. It's an unconscious thing that happens. And before you know it, you forgot your language. Before you know it, you can't or aren't eating the foods that you used to eat, right? And to some extent, that really chips at your identity, right? So I'll pause here for a second so you can look at some of these similarities and differences. And I'll also take a drink of water and encourage you to ask any questions you might have and take a look at the notes. Excuse me, comments is what I meant to say.
Bernal, I'll just mention that, is it Naten? Has a question about, so it's not related to assimilation and acculturation and all the nuance, but has to do with an unaccompanied child sponsor. And if depending on the sponsor's immigration status, does that affect their eligibility to sponsor a UC?
It does not on paper. A person is not ineligible because of their lack of status, right? We formulate that as a potential risk, right? We understand that, for instance, we have an obligation to do a 30-day call after release. We understand that if you have no status and you're sponsoring somebody who may or may not have status, you may choose to never answer the phone again because you don't want to be found, right? So those things kind of get formulated, but they're not part of a formal process of establishing whether or not somebody is eligible or isn't. We're not really concerned with the status officially, right? On paper, we're not really concerned with the status of the sponsor. Perhaps a better way to say that is having no status does not limit your ability to sponsor somebody.
What I will say on that too is if they were a case that were to be received for intensive case management and the sponsor themselves had other needs and they met an ORR eligibility criteria, they could potentially receive intensive case management services themselves.
Yeah.
We have a slide on that in a moment. But back to you, Bernal.
Yeah, no problem. Everyone's so astute. I love this, basically allowing us to foreshadow the things we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. So I feel like, a lot of the challenges that children encounter stem from this tension between acculturation and assimilation, right? It's not like one has to choose one or the other. And it's not like we can easily just sort of identify with one way of being. I speak from experience in this way, right? I've always had the privilege of having my family here. On November 1st, we're going to have this Guatemalan food called fiambre, which is, All Saints Day food that is very, very unique to Guatemala. You really can't find it anywhere else. And my mom's got plans that we're all going to come over and chop vegetables and pickle vegetables and bring chorizo and other things to make it together, right? It's like a dream. There's a lot of people who don't have that. I've been in the US for over 30 years now. We're still doing these kinds of things. My mom's still going to make my favorite dessert, torrejas, for that particular holiday, right? My mom is aging. She may not be here much longer. And, it's my responsibility to learn how to make these things and pass it on. But that's not true for a lot of folks. And it's not true for a lot of children. It's not true, certainly, for those category 4 kids who are going to be, who are likely to end up in a foster home, right? Who are folks of different backgrounds and different ethnicities who have different customs, right? Folks with good intentions may encourage the children to retain their values, but it's going to be way more difficult for them than it is for me, right? If we agree, going back a couple of slides, right? We don't have to literally go back, but if we agree that the triple trauma paradigm is in fact the thing, right? We need to then also ask ourselves, how will children begin to process the events that they've experienced, the potentially traumatizing experiences that they've lived through when they resurface? How are they going to do that? How is this trauma going to manifest itself? Let's think of a really simple example, right? These children are expected to be going to school. Not all of the children who we see in our program were going to school. In a lot of places in Central America, kids don't go to school past 12 years old, especially if you're a boy. If you're a boy, you're expected to contribute, right? It's not a value that they observe, right? Boys who are 15 should be working and providing. They shouldn't be at school playing with crayons, right? I mean, this is the way they look at it, right? But here we are trying to insert our Western values and saying education is very important. I'll never say education is not important. I love learning, right? But if their value system is different, we have to recognize that is going to represent a challenge for them, one that is based on values, and it's going to create tension for them, right? Not only that, once they enter school, the environment is totally different. I remember going to school, even though I did go to, a private school in Guatemala City, realizing, oh my gosh, lockers are a real thing. They're not just from the movies. That's very cool. You can actually decorate your own locker. That's very cool. There is a period of honeymoon, right? There's a period of, I think, about maybe 3 months where kids are just really enjoying going to the grocery store and seeing the aisles of endless boxes of cereal of different colors, right? Or just like the display of soda cans that you could have never fathomed in your life. And then you have to ask yourself, why are there so many choices, right? Why is there so many different types of Coca-Cola, right? All of that is really sort of, underlined with wonder, right? I mean, it's really kind of awesome when you think about it that way. And unfortunately, it's short-lived, because then you realize when you're in school that your environment is overwhelming. It feels chaotic. It feels really unpredictable, right? These are concepts from trauma-informed care, right? In order to provide trauma-informed care, we have to provide predictability. We have to minimize apparent chaos, right? Schools aren't like that. Schools can be really overwhelming for kids, right? And again, this is just one example, right? They may also see police officers in the school systems, right? And not everybody who's come to the US has a positive relationship with authority, right? I would argue not everyone in the US has a positive relationship with authority, right? It's a scary thing to see cops in schools. It's a scary thing to start, hearing bells and the whole school goes in lockdown and you have no idea that this is a drill or why we're having these types of drills, right? And these things can really sort of elicit that trauma manifestation, right? And so we get into some clinical stuff here about how do we address that with the kids that we're working with, right? They may be getting some unwanted attention from peers. They may be getting teased. They may get teased, especially, unfortunately, very sadly, by other migrant kids. There's a story out of Maryland think it was Maryland, where already adjusted or more integrated migrant kids were being really mean to kids who were coming out of the unaccompanied children programs, and they even banned the word chanchi, which means piglet. I think we may have talked about this last time. But the schools decided to ban the word chanchi as they've banned the N word, right? Because it was derogatory and mean to children. So, unfortunately in high schools and really, really in almost any environment where you have these social strata, right? These unaccompanied children sort of end up at the bottom, and they don't proudly identify as unaccompanied children. We have to sort of elicit that information from them. There's a lot of stigma that comes from having been an unaccompanied child. I think that's really unfortunate. And it comes from a certain narrative that we've all partaken into, right? And we'll talk about that. So some of you are familiar with this slide because we talked about it last week or 2 weeks ago, was it? But, some of the, again, this tension that exists while the children are still trying to navigate the different areas of their lives, right? I don't know if you're familiar with eco-maps, but this sort of reminds me of that. It's like, I'm a child, and ultimately my own well-being is at stake here. And these are the things I have to consider, right? How do I maintain my relationship with God, right? How do I tell my sponsor that I'm actually queer, right? How do I convey to my parents back in home country that I'm not working because I'm actually in school and I like it, right? How do I navigate this depression that makes me feel like I don't want to get out of bed, right? How do I navigate the news that my grandmother is very sick and she may not make it and I will not be able to travel back to go see her, right? How do I navigate these different systems, right? I got a PRS worker and I got a PC worker, and they keep asking me the same things. And they keep telling me this is all for my well-being, but I'm sick and tired of talking to both of them, and I don't want to answer their questions anymore, right? Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Thank you, Sasha. So here we have, I borrowed these slides from Sasha. These are really mostly for the benefit of the folks who are on this call on the PRS end of things, right? Because I have no reason to believe that you have this information. That doesn't mean that you don't have it. I just don't. I don't have any reason to believe that this has been made available to you, right? So for folks who know that their children will be receiving PRS services, right? For any case that has a home study or anything that identifies them as eligible for PRS, I think it's really wise for you to also know that these categories make some of the UCs that we work with also eligible for community services, right? So, what's really important here is to underscore that unless somebody already has the status of asylee or refugee, they would not be eligible. Somebody might be an asylum seeker. Somebody may have an attorney. Somebody may have been referred to a legal service provider to go and pursue an asylum case. But if they've not been granted, then they don't necessarily meet eligibility for this. But they would if they're Haitian or Cuban, right? Or if they've been identified as a victim of trafficking, for example, right? Also the time, if somebody's been granted status, and this would not be the case for the kids that we work with in OR care, but if somebody's been granted status in the US more than 5 years ago, they may not be eligible, right? But there are exceptions that can be requested. So I myself got my status, about 15 years ago, so I wouldn't be, but an exception could be made, I suppose, right? Okay, yeah. Nathan, I see what you're saying there. And, that's sort of something that I experience in my life as well. Yeah. A lot could be said about that. Thank you for your observation. Yeah. So, these are the vulnerability categories, right? And earlier today I was meeting with Sasha and said, says who, right? Where does this come from? Because we could add a lot to this, right? But this is an ORR identified categories of vulnerability. So now I'm going to encourage you and see if, this should be a little easier, right? When you think about our case of Karelis, right? Under what circumstances would we be able to say, according to ORR, these are the piece of vulnerability categories that she falls under, right? So if anybody cares to either enter in the chat or just raise your hand and say, this is true for her, right? What are some things for her that would make her especially vulnerable according to this?
Insufficient support from the family. Anything else standing out there in terms of vulnerability categories? Any PC case managers want to offer their
Well, she's a
input?
minor actually, so I'm for minor.
She's a
Perfect.
minor. Mhm.
Exactly right.
What about sexual abuse? Yes, Natan. Cecilia? Yes, exactly. We need to note that.
Hmm. Exactly. And, as a former clinician, it's difficult for me to imagine that she is psychologically intact, right? Your mother abandoned you. Your mother did not believe you, right? And maybe that's, part of what we mean by insufficient support from family, right? Um, your brother passed away recently, the person who really showed you that they loved and cared about you, right? And the person who you thought was your sister-in-law, at least according to the US government, isn't even your family, right? I mean, it's difficult to imagine that this person is psychologically intact, right? Yeah, I agree. Traumatic impact, possibly, right? So I think, Karelis is kind of a home run, right? Just to use the current baseball reference, but, she is a kind of a home run for eligibility for this, right? And so now we need to start sort of formulating, right? We're going to have to sort of welcome Karelis into our sphere of PC services. And also keep in mind, she's probably going to be referred to post-release services. We have to formulate things like an intake, a service plan, right? And start identifying where and how we can intervene and start developing safety planning for her, right? So this visual is for you to keep in mind as we move on through the next few slides. So we'll start with intake, right? So best practices for intake and care coordination, right? One of the first few things we need to understand is OR will make a referral to PC services, right? And when the referral is made, you will receive documentation from them. Some of the documentation you'll receive is when this child was released from care, right? And usually it's not very long. It's maybe 2, 4, 5 days, something like that. Please correct me if I'm wrong about that. You'll need to understand the quality status and the role of caregiver and sponsor care, right? So who is this person to the child? And how is that relationship, how is it going? Has it been maintained while the child was in care? Did they speak on the phone? Were they cordial and kind? Was this sponsor taken by surprise? Like, hey, surprise, I'm in the US and you need to sponsor me. Or did the sponsor have anything to do with this child coming to the US? And why, right? You'll have to review the post-release documents that are included in the referral, right? And some of that information is minimal, right? But eventually you'll have to determine if this case will be eligible for post-release services. And the things that are making cases automatic post-release services are category 3 home studies, that kind of thing. Also, the current practice is to ensure that every child has post-release services, and there are different levels of post-release services. I need to introduce that idea now because we're going to dive into it pretty soon. So there are different levels of post-release services, but if a child is referred to post-release services, I think it would be really wise for you as a PC worker to understand that right off the bat, right? If the child has been referred to PRS services, this is when you would do the kind of thing that Yvonne was talking about, right? It's like at some point you need to contact that other person and find out if we're duplicating services and if in some level that's overwhelming the child, right? And if that child is not receiving post-release services, but you come to an understanding that they need those services, or you come to an understanding that the sponsor needs those services, then you can provide them with this information here where they can request services themselves, right? Then you're going to have to determine if a safety plan was developed while the child was in care and why, right? Now, that's not information the child is likely to have. That's information the sponsor is likely to have because more than likely they were made part of that safety planning. Most of the children, almost 100% of the children that come out of the facility where I work, PCC, have a generic safety plan. But some children have a very specific safety plan. For instance, a pregnant child, right? Well, let me rephrase that because we don't keep pregnant kids at our facility. Let's say that somebody has a autoimmune disease or something like that, right? If somebody has a known condition that is going to require ongoing care, we will develop a medical safety plan for that child, and it would behoove you to find it, read it, and become very familiar with it, right? Obviously, with authorization and permission from the family and the child, right? If you determine, however, that the child's needs are not being made by ORR standards and by all social work standards, you will need to call CPS and make an appropriate referral, right? That's going to be something that will be between you and your supervisor as you understand the child's needs and their welfare, right? You'll need to discover if the minor has received a 30-day phone call yet. So all children who are released from OR should receive a 30-day phone call that we call a wellness call, right? We just call and find out how things are going. And there we sometimes discover that they're going to need more support, and then we make the appropriate referrals. And then as an ongoing concept, you really need to be assessing the child's health, education, and other processes of integrating and becoming more self-sufficient in their environment. I want to make a side note here real quick that my team at Endeavors has an exhaustive, not exhaustive because it can't ever be complete, but it's a very thorough list of services per state. And sometimes we get as, sort of granular as like the city where they live, right? And so we have this database of services based on state. I believe the only two states we've never released a child into are North Dakota and Alaska. For every other state, we have a list of services available. It might be really wise for all of your affiliates if you have the capacity and the person power to start collecting those and share among others, right?
So Maya had a question for you,
I
Bernal,
see
which
it.
is,
Yeah.
what happens if they don't call? What would you advise
Right.
in
So
that
there's two
sense?
things to look at here, right? One is what happens or doesn't like it, So for that, we have to make several attempts. We have a database where we enter our attempts and document that 3 attempts were made. By rules of ORR, we have to make 3 attempts. If we document that 3 attempts were made and that's that, then we just sort of assume and conclude that this family doesn't want anything to do with ORR anymore, and that's it, right? Of course, the implicit stuff there is that we won't know what the status of that child is, right? And that can be alarming, right? And we'll get into that as well. That can be alarming because now we don't know what's going on with these children. But seldom do we think about the notion that children and sponsors continue to have the right to self-determination. And they may simply not want to talk to you anymore. They may simply not want to talk to a group of so-called social workers who convinced my sister-in-law that she's not my sister-in-law, that we're not family, right? That made us go through this process that ultimately was very harmful to her and to me, almost destroyed us. She only has me and I only have her. And on top of that, you're going to make me talk to you. You're going to make me open my door to you and let you in my house. Like that's not something I'm really interested in doing, right? Our intentions are good, but as I tell my team all the time, your intentions being good make you just like the rest of us, right? There's nothing really that special about having good intentions. You have to have good intentions and good training. You have to have good intentions and not let your ego get in the way, right? This person is not calling, not answering the phone. You can't get offended. But ultimately, to answer your question in very simple terms, we document that we made the attempts and that the family opted not to answer the call. That's it. Okay. So as we talk about these, sort of intake practices, Sasha, walk me through this. We're going to do
I think we wanted to highlight the care coordination component of ensuring, like you had just mentioned, that safety-related concerns during a preferred community's intake are being addressed, sort of triaged. So I think the question here for the audience is how are we ensuring that? What are we looking at? So we just invite you to dialogue with this kind of question. Yvonne, your case example was really interesting because it seemed predetermined in a way that the local CYF office would be vested with the care of the child through the youth program that they were placed in. And so then the determination was that, you wouldn't necessarily engage in doing case management with the individual or moving forward in a safety plan. Yeah. So feel free to either add in the chat or go ahead and engage with the Slido. You can pull it up on your phone if you would like to, as you're thinking through your best practices in case management service provision, what are the safety related areas you'd want to attend to with a minor, with a UC minor in particular? Do I have to go to the next slide to see this, or I'm not remembering?
No, I think I'm gonna send something just to ensure it's working, right?
There we are.
Is.
Okay. Does
So
everyone
if you
have access to this?
Scan, click the link, then you can start entering, like what sort of safety concerns are you going to be addressing here, right?
So I'm just pulling it up from my phone, yeah? Follow up, yes. With who?
While folks are doing that, I'm going to address the question: can you do a surprise home visit if the attempted 3 calls fail? No, we don't. We don't do that because the standard is a phone call, right? So if they're not answering the phone after 3 attempts, we assume that a person doesn't want anything to do with that, and we participate in the concept of respecting their self-determination. However, there are cases where somebody has been referred to what we call level 3 PRS, right? And those cases require an in-person visit, right? Now, whether it needs to be a surprise or not, I think it needs to happen. You need to go there and have an in-person visit. You need to at least attempt it, right? Is it designed to be a surprise? I would hope not, but sometimes it may surprise people to see you there, right? Living conditions, sleeping arrangements, referrals, healthcare, mental health care. Yeah. I mean, this is starting to look like the bubbles I put, right? on the thing. It's just like all of these things that we need to be concerned with, right? I think some of these got fragmented. Unannounced visits, and then the word may. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Very good. Thank you very much. So now we're going to talk about, again, going on with the intake and service plan notion, right? How do we identify specific risk in the intake and service plan? This would be based on an assessment, right? You would have to develop, if you don't already have, a tool that can very easily sort of help you go back to your desk and assess like what's going on here, right? Based on priorities, based on urgency, right? You're going to also have to look at special concerns. This is not, a complete list of concerns, but the things that come to mind usually are trafficking and exploitation. Just because a child was not being exploited or was not a victim of trafficking prior to release doesn't mean that they're okay. It doesn't mean that they're going to be unscathed once they're out there in the community, right? There was a story that I'm familiar with where a woman got her daughter a job and she was dropping her off at her job instead of taking her to school, and the mother was picked up for trafficking, right? And subsequently had to deal with some legal consequences of that, right? We'll have to also assess, as we continue to develop our service plan, we'll have to come to terms with whether or not we need to provide better or more access to language, right? If the shelter facility did not use an interpreter, but it becomes clear to you that one is needed, then you'll need to do that, right? And how do we coordinate if there are numerous or more than one case manager? Because in a lot of cases, it appears as if you will have a PC worker and a PRS worker, right? And that's sort of becoming obvious to me as we develop this. And I wonder how many of you had already thought about that, But there seems to be not only a great deal of gap in services, but sometimes the duplication of services itself sort of like opens up what is an obvious gap, right? Somebody should be coordinating that. That lack of coordination seems to be a gap. And if it's going to be filled by the 2 case managers, then we need to sort of start getting into our minds that this needs to be a real cordial relationship between PC and PRS worker, right? And then something that's going to be really critical is the date of the referral and the type of PRS the child has been referred to will be crucial in this part, right? So for example, if the PC worker receives the PC referral 2 days after the child was released, but the PRS worker hasn't even accepted the case, then the PC worker will be the first person to make a contact with the child. And then that child will then hear from the PRS worker and say, wait a minute, I already got a call from Yvonne. And the PRS worker is going to be like, who's Yvonne? Right? And now we're putting the child in the middle to help us coordinate that. And that's sort of like what I'm anticipating will be a real challenge, right? So more on all of this a little bit later. Thank you, Sasha. So a real education on PRS level of care, right? The things that I really thought would be useful to you all would be to understand, first of all, that there are 3 levels of care. This is different than category. When we refer to category, we're talking about the relationship the child has with the sponsor. A category 1 is a parent, usually. Category 2 can be a sibling. A category 3 is more of a distant relative, right? That has nothing to do with PRS level of care. Level 1 is the most sort of like minimal level of care that a child can receive, right? There haven't been any home studies. There aren't really any concerns to be mitigated. There really is no need for level 2 or level 3, right? And it's comprised really of 3 virtual check-ins, day 7, 14, and 30, And if you need to extend this level of care, you just need to offer some justification, right? I'm going to turn to any experts on PRS here in case I'm saying things that are not true. Next is level 2, right? So this would be for anybody who's already undergone a home study, or maybe we've identified some other needs based on the child's presentation that we believe level 2 care would benefit the child from ongoing services, right? This can be up to 6 months. It can be extended. You need to have an in-home visit within 14 days of the referral acceptance, right? So a child may be referred to a home study, to a PRS agency, but that PRS agency may take 7 days to accept the case, right? Once they accept the case, from there, they have 14 days to actually do a home visit. You need to be assessing the safety of the child, the sponsor's ability to access community resources and educate the family as well, right? And then level 3 is the more intense, right? In fact, folks who are working with level 3 cases are considered intensive case managers, sometimes clinicians, right? You have to have contact within 2 days of the referral being accepted. Again, this gives ample opportunity for the PC worker to make contact with that person, right? Let's see here. You have to have your first assessment within 7 days. You will have weekly visits for up to 60 days, and then consider these to be monthly, right? If you can sort of make a case for that. They don't have to be weekly. They can be monthly after that, but you have to sort of explain why, and you have to formulate a plan for that, right? This will involve intensive in-home services that will be carried out by the staff that I described, clinicians or intensive case managers. Services are for 180 days or for TVPRA cases until the child turns 18. So Carelis was a TVPRA case, and she's only 16. So she's likely to have these services for the next 2 years, right? Unless for some reason it's formulated that she otherwise doesn't need them, right? But this is, presumably of great benefit for her if she wants these services, right? And if they're benefiting her. The task here is to connect the family to long-term services to address identified concerns such as mental health diagnosis, crisis intervention, safety planning, and family preservation, right? Under eligibility, you can see here if there's family conflict or if the family is considered to be especially vulnerable, if the child is psychologically fragile, or if there's challenges related to their education, then they can be presented as a level 3 and they could then qualify for those services, right? Now we go on to PC programming services. These are broken down by category. So not levels. We're talking about the relationship the sponsor has with the child. For category 1, what we need to do here is assess whether or not the family qualifies for GAP services, right? And what we'll be focusing on here is resources and referrals, and have sort of an open door. We can continue to assist you, right? For category 2 and 3, now this is based on the premise that category 2 and 3 don't have the type of relationship with the child that a category 1 would, like a parent, right? Category 2, you have, a cousin or something like that, or a distant relative. You will be assessing for intensive case management and PC services, right? Focus here will be intake assessment and developing an ongoing service plan. Consider that an organic document that sort of evolves depending on the child's needs and their adjustment as they move through and navigate that last leg of the triple trauma paradigm, right? And then those category 4 are those kids that really don't have anyone, who are presumably in foster care or in a long-term facility where they're getting all the services that they need, and so they will not be referred to PC programming, okay? And so now for the visual that I had previously referenced, right? This is our Venn diagram where we have post-release services on the left side. There's level 1, level 2, and level 3. We've talked about what those are. And then there's the preferred communities, which will be offering GAP services, intensive case management, and group support. And in many of those cases, really, these circles should have overlapped a lot more, right? Because that space in the middle seems to be probably greater than I've illustrated here, right? We sort of needed to move the circles in a more concentric fashion, right? There's the overlap that we're going to see, right? And how we work with that overlap really is going to, I think, affect the wellness of the child, right? We should not be putting the child in that position. We should be working collaboratively with one another to ensure that the needs of the child are being met. And how we do that really is sort of like the next challenge. Because as far as I know, and you're welcome to correct me if I'm wrong here, there is no current guidance on that. There's no current guidance on how are we going to collaborate with these other well-intended professionals who sometimes are stepping on my toes, right? Not because they don't know what they're doing, but because their priorities seem to be overlapping with mine, right? And so that's sort of the delicate approach to this. I'm going to pause here for any questions or any comments that you might have, because I think this is really important.
I might invite some of our preferred communities, case managers to embody some of the questions you might want to ask in an intake based on this overlap that we're seeing in terms of how you're thinking about care coordination. And then Carrie, I'd love to have you come off mute and ask your question too. So first, PC case managers, how might you engage in an intake? What are some of the questions you'd be asking so that you're aligning your services with that of post-release services? Anything you're thinking comes to mind? Yvonne, maybe I'll call on you if you're still with us, or Isabel, only because I see your picture there. Not to put anyone on the spot, but what are some of the things you might think are really important in terms of your questions that you would generate in your intake?
Yeah, I can share. Just with the caveat that I don't do this, on a regular basis. It's kind of like based on my experience and what I can advise my team. I think for me, it's very important to talk about like in two parts, like what the minor is feeling at this moment and address what is more urgent for them. As Bernal was saying, there are some things that on our end feel like urgent, but the kids are thinking many other different things. They are focused on, like for instance, the cases that we have had on unaccompanied minors, they were very worried about the changing schools. They were enrolled in a school system. When they were part of the shelter, they were going to soccer, to activities, to after-school activities. And when they were reunited with their parents, their concerns were more like, what is going to happen with all of these things that I already built? And that transition, we weren't thinking of necessarily like the soccer classes. So I think that for me is being mindful of what the kid is feeling and validating that and recognizing that those things are important, but then also help them see what is the plan and set realistic expectations with some things are going to take longer than others, and like the support that they're going to receive and how is that going to look like, and help them see kind of like the path of where we want to try to get, like the goals that they have, the goals that our program also have, because I also think that that's also challenging. Programs have specific goals that we have to complete, and those sometimes don't match what the client, the minor, is thinking or like expecting. So kind of like have those conversations very openly and very kindly and with a lot of patience. So I'm not sure, Sasha, if I hit your
You
question.
did. I mean, you're meeting the minor where they're at and engaging with what they're identifying as their immediate needs. And some of that might be some collateral information and through release of information that you might have from anyone else that might be involved in the youth life. So thinking through kind of a streamlined coordination with that could be very helpful. Bernal, I'm not sure if you have some comments as well.
No, I think, that is a perpetual challenge for case managers, right? It's like, I have these standards that need to be met, and I'm also identifying what the child very subjectively is saying, these are my priorities, right? And so how do we navigate that, right? We can't just ignore the standards that are set for us and the basis for the grants that we get, right? We still have to do our job, right? But we're not going to do that at risk of ignoring completely what the child's needs are. So that is the art, ultimately, right, of case management. Had a professor who often made references to our tool bag, right? And at some point you develop mastery of the tools in your bag, and so you understand which tools to use when. But just because you've done it successfully with one case doesn't mean that the next case is going to be easier, right? So that is ultimately the art of case management, trying to navigate and balance those things equally, right? So thank you for identifying that so beautifully, Yvonne.
Isabel, did you have a comment? I saw you come on screen.
Yeah, I can add on. I appreciate your invitation. It made me think of something. So thanks for prompting it. It came in my mind. I think I would also, I think this has been throughout the training, but I would ask, really just try to map out and understand support systems for the young person, because that can help in many ways. I think one, by exploring the support system, talking to the adults responsible for their care, but also directly to the minor, we can see their perspective on who are their important relationships in their life. And kind of to Yvonne's comment, what are the support systems that somebody once had and feels that they've lost? And what would it be like to recreate those? Not just from the point of view of emotionally the young person's perspectives and what relationships matter to them, but also in terms of resources, who can they turn to, which adults are providing what kind of support, who provides the financial support, but who really is the one that the young person turns to if they feel unsafe or if they have concerns. Who are those trusted adults, if any, and peers as well, learning about their adaptation to school. I think framing it through what's their network of support, it helps touch on multiple things, like the losses, the resources, the contacts that we should keep as well, and how the young person relates to the different people in their life. So that's just another thing that I think came up throughout the training.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm looking at time and my anxiety is kicking in, so I'm going to address. Sorry.
Yeah, Bernal, where do you want to go? Do you want to continue with your slides, or do you want to respond?
I think so. I think this is really important, but I don't need to spend a lot of time on this. I often present on the topic of narratives and how to, sort of like understand the evolution of narratives and where they come from, right? So I need to make a disclaimer here. This article, Alone and Exploited Migrant Children Work Brutal Jobs Across the U.S., done by Hannah Dreyer in the New York Times, resulted in Congress having a very, very, very loud and, sort of like active discussion around the wellness of the children. There's a video clip of the gentleman from Louisiana telling somebody from ORR that they had lost track of the children, and they aren't actually children. They're 16-year-olds, right? And they don't have to tell you where they are, and they're gone, man. This is what he says. They're gone into the fabric of America, right? And really sort of projecting this fear that we all need to have of these not children, right? Really kind of gets me fired up. I'm sure you can tell, because at the end of the day, a child is a child is a child. A child is a child until they're an adult, in which case they're not a child, right? But a 16-year-old is a child, and they deserve protection, and they deserve an opportunity to do well, whether they've been exploited or whether they've been made to do things they didn't want to do, right? But this article really resulted, it drove this concept of like, ORR doesn't know where the kids are, ORR doesn't do a good job tracking them. This is where this idea that every child should have PRS came from, right? I mean, some people think it's a waste of services. I personally think it's a really good idea, but I also know not every child wants to tell you where they are. I'm not confused. I know some of those kids are working, right? Another thing this article really brought up is that, to some extent, we're all involved, right? If we're eating Cheetos and we're wearing Fruit of the Loom and you're having, Chewy bars, we're participating in this concept of migration is a thing because cheap labor continues to be the thing that we all apparently are benefiting from, right? So the Department of Labor got involved, etc. And sadly, I got involved because I'm misquoted in this article. And by the way, I was not even personally directly interviewed. Somebody was in a presentation I was doing years before I worked at Endeavors, so my name got thrown in there, and obviously I was very upset, and I reached out to the reporter and said, you need to check that, and she kind of told me where to go. So there it is. I encourage you to read it because it really has a lot to do with sort of where the current narrative of children who came from these programs is. That's where the narrative is, in large part because of this article, right? The current narrative is the children are gone. The government doesn't know where they are. They're being exploited. And if you think the government is acting to protect these kids, you're wrong. The government is acting in ways that puts these kids at risk. Therefore, every child should have PRS. That's sort of where that came from. PRS has blown up. The programs are extensive. There's a lot of staff that used to work under my supervision now working in PRS, because that's where the opportunities are right now, right? And that makes sense. That staff should continue to stay in the sphere of this world and this work that they're passionate about, right? And unfortunately, the narrative really sort of evolves and ends up in this concept that, migrants at large, including children, represent two categories. We're the bad guys in the picture above, right? Or we are the victims and we suffer and we need rescuing, right? Again, I wholeheartedly identify with the community I work with, right? And there's really nothing in between, right? We don't really talk about migrants and refugees or unaccompanied children who want to have barbecues at the park, right? Or who would like to tell stories or who like to play video games and have a streaming channel, right? We don't really consider migrants in those spaces. There's really only two categories. We participate in those narratives by continuing to save children, right? By continuing to placate children as victims and migrants at large as children, right? Or by continuing to perpetuate the narrative that there is a great deal of fear that we need to be experiencing. Don't get me started on Ohio and Haitian staff and Haitian folks, I should say, right? Because that's a real hot thing that's made everybody real scared. And it's really kind of, created a great deal of division, right? And so how we work to change these, in my opinion, is really stay informed, work on behalf of children, try to understand their priorities, right? The desired outcomes. These will be obviously left up to your individual agencies, right? But continuing to look out for the safety and the overall wellness and safe adjustment and acculturation of the children is going to be really what we're going to continue to focus on. And we'll do that in the different ways that we do that, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that we're having deep impact on the lives of these children, right? Our priorities need to be very clear, but the wellness of the children will always continue to sort of drive the work that we're doing. And again, I said earlier that we may not have a whole lot of time to get into the concept of, staff care and burnout and vicarious trauma and all those things. It's its own presentation, but I encourage you to, just conceptualize this and try to understand this from the perspective that if your agency and your leadership and your organization is not creating this as a priority, then it doesn't make sense that you will make this a priority for yourself, right? It starts at the top. If you have an invitation from your supervisors to talk about how that's playing out in your agency, I encourage you to take it. I know it can be really dicey and risky, but find your voice and speak up for the things that you need, because we need you out there. We need all of you out there to continue to impact the lives of children who are really, again, I don't want to participate in these victims, right? But they're really ultimately vulnerable. That doesn't mean they're incapable. We need to continue to celebrate and uphold their resilience and their capacity for change and growth. But we can't do that if we can't show up and be present. That's all I have today. Thank you very much.
Bernal, thank you so much. I know that the series could have been perhaps even a couple of sessions just to unpack this. You provided us with so many important components for us to really unpack how our preferred communities programming interplays with the work that's happening through post-release services. I think we have a lot of questions. And I just invite people, I want to be as trauma-informed as possible. You've sat with us now for 90 minutes. If you'd like to stay for a couple more moments, you're welcome to. There is some questions here on a poll. Do let me know if you see that. I actually don't know if I'm doing that properly.
We see it.
Okay, great. Yes, feel free to complete that because we want to continue some support with Bernal in the future as we're crafting together our own guidance. Certainly in the absence of where there isn't explicit guidance coming from certain entities, we have the opportunity to generate that ourselves. So if anyone has any questions and wants to stay, please feel free. This is a great time for us to engage just for a couple more moments. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Bayanech.
Thank you, Stephanie, for being here. Appreciate you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Very informative.
I'm so glad. I will check in with Sasha later today. If there's any questions I can address, please let her know. I, as you can probably imagine, have to run to another meeting because I'm 2 minutes late already. I really
Okay.
appreciate you and hope to see you all very soon in another opportunity to talk about these interesting topics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bernal. Have a beautiful day ahead of you.
You as well. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Make sure you get water.
I
Stretch.
will.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll see you soon, okay?